If that dog starts barking after sunset, don't stay in that house, the old cashier said quietly as she slid the faded receipt across the counter, her weathered hands lingering for a moment before letting go. Jonah Price forced a polite smile, tucked the receipt into the pocket of his worn canvas jacket, and thanked her before stepping back into the cool mountain air. The warning sounded like one more small-town ghost story, the kind people repeated because they had nothing better to talk about. After 28 years wearing a police badge, Jonah had heard every rumor imaginable, and very few had ever survived the weight of facts. Retirement had brought him something stranger than danger. It had brought silence. The endless radio chatter was gone. The patrol car was gone. The daily purpose that had carried him through decades of service had disappeared with a handshake, a framed plaque, and a quiet ceremony attended by people already thinking about tomorrow. At 64, he wasn't searching for adventure. He was searching for peace. That was exactly why the abandoned cave house had caught his attention. The moment he found the listing, $400. The price alone made no sense. Built directly into the limestone hillside nearly 70 years earlier, the property sat miles outside the nearest town, surrounded by towering pines, narrow gravel roads, and rugged cliffs that blocked most of the afternoon sunlight. The realtor barely bothered showing it. She unlocked the rusted chain at the entrance, handed Jonah the keys, wished him luck, and left before he finished looking around. She hadn't even tried to convince him to buy it. That alone should have raised questions. But Jonah had seen something different. Thick stone walls that stayed naturally cool in summer. A solid roof carved into the mountain itself, fresh spring water trickling nearby. Quiet, real quiet. The kind of quiet he hadn't experienced since childhood camping trips with his father, long before life became measured by emergency calls and court reports. Beside him, Ace jumped effortlessly from the back of the pickup truck. The large German Shepherd landed softly on the gravel, immediately lifting his nose into the crisp mountain breeze. Unlike Jonah, Ace had never truly retired. The former police canine still carried himself like he expected another command at any moment. His ears pivoted independently, catching sounds too distant for human hearing. His amber eyes swept across the hillside with practiced patience. Jonah smiled as he watched his old partner begin another careful inspection. "Looks like it's just you and me again, buddy," he said, scratching the thick fur behind Ace's ears. The dog's tail wagged once before stopping, his attention already drifting toward the rocky hillside surrounding the entrance. The cave house looked older up close than it had in the photographs. Moss-covered portions of the stone facade. Heavy wooden shutters hung slightly crooked against narrow windows. A weathered iron lantern still rested beside the front door, as though someone expected to light it again one evening but never returned. Jonah unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cool air smelled faintly of damp stone, aged timber, and forgotten years. Dust floated through thin beams of sunlight slipping between cracked shutters. There wasn't much left inside. A rough wooden table, two handmade chairs, rusted hooks along one wall, a cold fireplace built directly into the rock. Nothing suggested wealth, nothing suggested mystery. Just an old shelter waiting for time to finish reclaiming it. Jonah set his duffel bag beside the fireplace and slowly turned in a full circle, imagining what the place could become with a little work. New flooring, fresh paint, better lighting. Maybe a porch overlooking the valley. It wasn't much, but after a lifetime of serving everyone else, it felt enough. Behind him, Ace remained unusually still. The German Shepherd wasn't looking at Jonah. He wasn't exploring the empty rooms either. Instead, he stood perfectly rigid near the rear wall where solid limestone disappeared into darkness. His ears stood high, his breathing slowed. Without making a sound, Ace fixed his eyes on a narrow crack between two ancient stone slabs, refusing to look away. Jonah watched the German Shepherd without speaking for several seconds. 20 years of working beside Ace had taught him one simple rule. When the dog locked onto something with that kind of focus, there was always a reason. He walked closer and rested a hand gently on Ace's shoulder. "What is it, partner?" he asked softly. Ace did not turn around. His nose remained inches from the narrow crack in the stone wall. He inhaled slowly, then took one careful step backward before returning to the exact same spot. Jonah frowned. "You smell something?" Ace answered by letting out a low whine instead of a bark. It was a sound Jonah had rarely heard during their years on the police force. It was not fear. It was frustration. Whatever scent had reached him seemed trapped behind solid rock. Jonah pulled a flashlight from his duffel bag and aimed the beam across the uneven limestone surface. The wall looked ancient. Hundreds of tiny mineral veins stretched across it like frozen streams, and decades of dust had settled into every crack. Nothing appeared unusual. He knocked against the stone with the handle of the flashlight. Solid. He moved a few feet to the left and knocked again. Solid. Then he tapped directly beside the narrow crack where Ace refused to move. The sound changed ever so slightly. Not hollow, but different enough to make him pause. "Well," Jonah muttered, "that is interesting." Ace immediately looked at him, his ears standing even higher. Jonah smiled. "You heard it too, did you not?" The dog gave a quick wag of his tail, before pressing his nose against the wall again. Outside, the afternoon breeze drifted through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and fresh mountain air into the cave house. Jonah stepped onto the porch and grabbed an old pry bar and a small hammer from the toolbox in his truck. Before returning inside, he noticed an elderly man slowly driving past in a dusty green pickup. The truck rolled to a stop, the driver's window lowered halfway. The man studied Jonah for several seconds before speaking. "You bought the old place?" Jonah nodded. "Sure did." The old man glanced toward the cave entrance. "You planning on staying?" "That is the idea." The man hesitated. "Most folks do not last more than a night." Jonah chuckled politely. "Bad plumbing?" The old man did not smile. "No, just memories." Before Jonah could ask another question, the pickup continued down the gravel road and disappeared between the pines. Jonah stood quietly for a moment before shaking his head. Everybody around here enjoys a mystery. When he stepped back inside, Ace had not moved an inch. The dog was now sitting directly in front of the wall, staring at the crack with complete concentration. Jonah knelt beside him. "All right," he said. "Let us see what has your attention." He carefully slid the flat end of the pry bar into the narrow opening between two stones. At first, nothing happened. He applied a little more pressure. Dust trickled onto the floor. A pebble rolled loose. Ace immediately stood and took 2 quick steps backward, watching every movement. Jonah worked patiently, loosening decades of packed dirt from the seam. Finally, something small slipped free and landed with a faint metallic click on the stone floor. Both man and dog froze. Jonah reached down and brushed away the dust with his fingertips. Resting in the palm of his hand was an old tarnished metal badge, no larger than a silver dollar. The engraved lettering had nearly disappeared beneath years of corrosion, but one word remained surprisingly clear in the flashlight beam: Marshall. Before Jonah could examine it any closer, Ace suddenly lifted his head toward the dark hallway, leading deeper into the cave house. Every muscle in his body became rigid again, as though he had just heard footsteps that Jonah could not hear. The silence inside the cave house stretched for several long seconds. Jonah slowly turned his flashlight toward the dark hallway, but the beam reached only a short distance before the passage bent sharply into the mountain. Ace remained perfectly still, every muscle tight with concentration. "Easy, partner," Jonah said in a calm voice. "Tell me what you have." The German shepherd did not bark. Instead, he took 3 deliberate steps toward the hallway, stopped, then looked back at Jonah as if asking permission. That was an old habit from their years working together. Jonah nodded once. "Lead the way." Ace moved forward at a careful pace, his paws making almost no sound against the smooth stone floor. Jonah followed close behind, sweeping the flashlight from side to side. The air grew noticeably cooler with every step. Moisture clung to the walls, and the faint smell of old limestone mixed with something else, something dry and strangely familiar. "This place has been sealed for a long time," Jonah whispered to himself. The hallway opened into a wider chamber no larger than a 1-car garage. Unlike the front room, this space looked surprisingly organized. Flat stones had been stacked into crude shelves along one wall. Rusted lantern hooks still hung from the ceiling. Someone had spent time here. Ace circled slowly, nose close to the ground, before stopping beside a weathered wooden crate tucked beneath a ledge. Jonah knelt and brushed away years of dust. The lid had already split from age. Inside were several empty glass jars, a dented tin cup, and a folded wool blanket that had almost turned gray with time. "Someone lived here," Jonah murmured. "Not for a night, for a while." Ace suddenly turned toward the far corner of the chamber. His ears lifted again. Jonah walked over and aimed the flashlight across the rock wall. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then the light reflected off a tiny metal object wedged between 2 stones. He carefully reached inside and pulled out a small brass key attached to a faded leather strip. There were no markings except a single number stamped into the metal. 7. Jonah slipped it into his pocket. "You keep surprising me, Ace." The dog gave a soft huff but continued staring at the same wall. Jonah examined the limestone more closely. Unlike the natural rock surrounding it, one section had straight edges that almost disappeared beneath decades of mineral deposits. He pressed his hand against it. "Cold, smooth, artificial." "That is not part of the mountain," he said quietly. He searched along the edge until his fingers found a narrow groove hidden beneath dust. He pushed gently. Nothing happened. He tried pulling instead. Still nothing. Whatever this is, Jonah said, it was meant to stay hidden. Just then a faint sound echoed through the chamber. It was not loud. It was the soft scrape of loose gravel somewhere beyond the stone wall. Jonah froze. Ace immediately stepped in front of him, standing tall without making a sound. Both remained perfectly still, listening. The scrape came again, followed by complete silence. Jonah lowered his voice to almost a whisper. Ace, I do not think we are hearing the mountain settle. Jonah kept one hand on Ace's collar while both listened in complete silence. The faint scraping sound did not come again. Instead, the cave returned to the steady rhythm of dripping water somewhere deep inside the mountain. He let out a slow breath. Either my imagination is getting stronger, or this place is not finished telling its story. Ace remained focused on the hidden section of the wall. His ears twitched once before he lowered his nose to the floor and began following a scent that curved along the base of the limestone. Jonah switched the flashlight toward the ground. A thin layer of dust covered everything, but one narrow strip looked different, almost as though countless footsteps had slowly polished the stone decades earlier. You found something again, did not you? Jonah asked. Ace answered with a quiet huff and stopped beside an old wooden shelf carved directly into the rock. Most of the shelf had collapsed, leaving only a few weathered objects behind. Jonah carefully lifted an old enamel coffee cup. Beneath it rested a folded piece of yellowed paper protected inside a rusted metal tin. The lid resisted at first before finally giving way with a dry crack. Inside was not money or jewelry. It was a hand-drawn map. Jonah unfolded it carefully. Faded pencil lines outlined the cave chambers with surprising detail. Small handwritten notes pointed toward water. Storage in another location simply marked with a circle and one sentence, safe room. Jonah studied the map for several seconds. Whoever stayed here planned everything. Ace suddenly walked toward the opposite side of the chamber and stopped beneath a narrow opening where daylight filtered through a crack high above. Jonah looked up. Fresh air drifted inside. That explains how someone could stay hidden for weeks. His eyes returned to the map. A second passage appeared to continue behind the very wall Ace had been investigating. There was only one problem. No doorway existed anymore. Jonah traced the drawing with his finger until he reached a tiny symbol that matched the brass key in his pocket. He slowly removed the key and held it beside the sketch. The shape matched perfectly. "You clever old dog," he whispered with a smile. "You did not bring me here for a badge. You brought me here for this." Just then the sound of tires rolling across gravel echoed faintly from outside. Jonah immediately folded the map and slipped it into his jacket. Ace lifted his head toward the entrance. Through the opening they could hear a truck engine idle for several seconds before shutting off. Neither man nor dog had expected visitors. Jonah exchanged a quiet look with Ace. "Stay close." They walked back toward the front room together. Sunlight streamed through the open doorway, but no one stood outside. The gravel driveway appeared empty. Jonah stepped onto the porch and slowly scanned the clearing. Everything looked peaceful except for one detail. Fresh tire tracks ended near the front of the house. Yet another set of tracks continued away. Whoever had arrived had stopped only briefly before leaving, without knocking. Jonah looked toward the tree line. Someone knows this place is no longer empty. Ace did not watch the road. Instead, he stared into the forest, his posture stiff, his nose lifted into the afternoon breeze, following the scent of someone who had already disappeared among the pines. Jonah waited another full minute before stepping away from the porch. The mountain had fallen quiet again, but it was no longer the peaceful silence he had welcomed when he first arrived. It carried the unmistakable feeling that someone else knew about the cave house. Ace lowered his nose to the fresh tires tracks and began following them slowly across the gravel. Jonah stayed close behind. "Easy, partner. Show me what you have." The German Shepherd followed the scent only 20 yards before stopping near the edge of the trees. He circled twice, then looked back at Jonah with an alert expression. "Whoever it was did not stay long," Jonah said. "They wanted to see if anyone was home." Ace gave a soft huff in agreement before turning back toward the cave. As they walked inside, Jonah locked the heavy wooden door behind them. He spread the hand-drawn map across the old table and studied every faded line beneath the beam of a lantern. The brass key rested beside it. "There has to be another entrance," he murmured. His finger traced the narrow passage leading beyond the hidden wall until it reached the symbol matching the key. If this map is accurate, there is another chamber behind that limestone. Ace suddenly nudged Jonah's elbow. "You think we should keep looking?" The dog immediately walked toward the hidden wall and stopped beside the narrow seam once again. Jonah smiled. "You always did hate unfinished cases." He examined the stone more carefully than before. This time he noticed tiny scratches around the edge of one rock that looked different from the natural erosion surrounding it. They were straight, almost deliberate. He inserted the brass key into a narrow opening he had overlooked earlier. At first, nothing happened. Then he felt a faint click somewhere inside the wall. Jonah stepped back instinctively. A low grinding sound echoed through the chamber, as one section of limestone shifted less than an inch before stopping. Dust drifted through the air. A narrow opening appeared, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways. Cold air flowed from the darkness beyond. Jonah looked at Ace. Well, I guess somebody expected this key to be found. Ace entered first without hesitation. Jonah followed with his flashlight raised. The hidden chamber was smaller than the first but remarkably dry. Wooden shelves lined one side of the room, and unlike the front chamber, several objects had survived almost untouched. There was an old oil lamp, neatly folded blankets, stacks of canned food long past their time, and a small writing desk built directly against the rock. Everything looked as though someone had walked away intending to return. Jonah slowly opened the top drawer. Inside lay a leather-bound journal wrapped in cloth to protect it from moisture. He carefully lifted it into the lantern light. The cover held no name, only a single date embossed in fading gold letters. 1978. Jonah opened the first page. The handwriting was steady and deliberate. The opening sentence stopped him cold. If anyone is reading this, it means Ace was right. Someone finally found the place before the truth disappeared forever. Jonah frowned in confusion. He looked down at his loyal companion. That cannot be possible, buddy. This was written decades before we ever came here. Ace remained motionless, staring toward the back corner of the hidden room, where another narrow passage disappeared into complete darkness. Jonah stared at the first page for several long seconds before carefully turning it over. The handwriting remained neat and deliberate, as though the writer expected someone to read every word many years later. If you found this journal, do not judge too quickly. Some people disappear because they are guilty. Others disappear because the truth makes them dangerous. Jonah read the sentence aloud. Ace sat quietly beside him, watching the narrow passage at the rear of the chamber without taking his eyes off the darkness. That sounds less like a confession and more like a warning, Jonah said. He continued reading. The journal described a former deputy United States Marshal named Samuel Mercer, who had taken refuge inside the cave after uncovering evidence that powerful men wanted hidden. There were no dramatic claims, only dates, locations, and careful observations written by someone trained to document facts. Jonah recognized the habit immediately. He wrote this like an investigator, he whispered. Ace suddenly stood and walked toward the old writing desk. He sniffed beneath it before placing one paw against the lower cabinet. You found something else? Jonah asked. He opened the cabinet and discovered a flat metal box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were several black and white photographs, a compass, and a leather document pouch sealed with a faded wax stamp. Jonah loosened the string and removed a stack of official papers. Most had yellowed with age, but one page immediately caught his attention. It carried the heading of a federal investigative office, along with several signatures. The final page was missing. Why would someone hide everything except the conclusion? Jonah wondered aloud. Ace gave a low huff before returning to the narrow passage. His posture changed again. This time he was not simply alert. He was waiting. Jonah switched on his flashlight and stepped beside him. All right, partner, let us see what is so important. The passage sloped gently downward for nearly 30 feet before opening into another small chamber carved entirely from natural limestone. Unlike the rooms above, this one contained no furniture. The floor was smooth except for a single wooden chest, resting against the far wall. Dust covered every surface except the top of the chest, where a clean streak crossed the lid, as though someone had brushed it recently. Jonah stopped immediately. That was not made 50 years ago. Ace examined the ground carefully, then looked back at Jonah. There were no clear footprints on the stone floor, but the absence of dust told its own story. Someone had been here not very long ago. Jonah approached the chest cautiously and lifted the lid. Inside were neatly stacked file folders tied together with cotton ribbon. Resting on top was a handwritten envelope. Across the front in steady block letters were 6 simple words, "For the honest officer who arrives first." Jonah felt a chill despite the still air inside the mountain. He slowly picked up the envelope and looked at Ace. I think whoever left this knew exactly the kind of person they hoped would find it. Before he could open the letter, Ace suddenly turned toward the entrance of the chamber and let out one sharp bark. The sound echoed through the cave. A second later, Faint footsteps answered from somewhere beyond the darkness. Jonah slowly raised the lantern, its warm light stretching across the narrow chamber. The footsteps stopped just beyond the edge of the darkness. Neither man nor dog moved. Ace stood squarely in front of Jonah, alert but silent, waiting for the next sound. Several long seconds passed before an elderly voice echoed through the passage. "If that dog has not barked twice, then you are probably one of the good ones." Jonah exchanged a quick glance with Ace before answering. "Who is there?" The reply came without hesitation. "Someone who has spent too many years wondering if anybody honest would ever find this place." A tall, gray-haired man stepped slowly into the lantern light with both hands clearly visible. His clothes were worn from years outdoors, but clean and carefully mended. His face carried deep lines that spoke more of time than hardship. Jonah remained cautious. "You knew about the hidden rooms." The stranger nodded. "I helped build part of them." Ace watched the man's every movement, then slowly relaxed. Jonah noticed immediately. During their years together, Ace had never lowered his guard around someone he believed to be a threat. "He trusts you," Jonah said quietly. The old man smiled faintly. "Dogs have always judged character better than people." Jonah lowered the lantern slightly. "My name is Jonah Price." "I know," the man replied. "The retired officer who bought this property instead of tearing it down like the others planned." Jonah frowned. "How could you know that?" The old man pointed toward the entrance of the chamber. "I have watched this mountain for a long time, not every day, just enough to know when strangers arrive." Jonah reached into his jacket and carefully removed the journal. "Did you know Samuel Mercer?" The man's expression softened immediately. "He saved my life." Silence settled over the chamber before the old man continued. "He was never hiding from justice. He was protecting it." Jonah slowly handed him the journal. The old man rested one weathered hand across the cover but did not open it. "I promised him that if an honest officer ever found this place, I would tell the rest of the story." Ace walked forward and gently sniffed the man's hand before sitting calmly beside him. Jonah smiled. "That is about the strongest recommendation anyone can receive." The old man chuckled softly. "His name? Ace." The man's eyes widened for a brief moment. "Then Samuel was right." Jonah looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" The old man pointed toward the first page of the journal. "Read the sentence again. Not the one about finding the truth, the one beneath it." Jonah quickly turned the page and held it beneath the lantern. Hidden beneath the folded edge of the paper was a second line he had missed before. The faded words read, "One day a faithful dog named Ace will lead the right person here." Jonah stared in disbelief before looking down at his longtime partner. "That is impossible." The old man slowly shook his head. "Not impossible, intentional." Samuel believed that some truths survive only when good people refuse to stop searching. Before Jonah could ask another question, the old man looked toward the tunnel entrance, his calm expression suddenly turning serious. "We are no longer alone," he whispered. "The people looking for those files have finally come back to the mountain." The old man's warning hung in the cool air as Jonah quietly slipped the envelope and the file folders into his canvas bag. Ace stood between them and the tunnel entrance, listening with complete concentration. The distant sounds did not grow louder, but they did not disappear either. Someone was moving carefully through the passages. "We should leave," the old man whispered. "Not because we are afraid, but because the truth matters more than this place." Jonah nodded. "Agreed, we have what we came for." The old man smiled faintly. "No, Officer Price, you found much more than you realize." Ace suddenly turned and trotted toward the rear passage instead of the main tunnel. He stopped once and looked back. Jonah understood immediately. "He wants us to follow." The old man gave a quiet laugh. "Samuel always said the mountain had more than one way out." They followed Ace through the narrow corridor until it widened into a natural limestone passage that sloped gently upward. Fresh air drifted toward them. Sunlight filtered through thin cracks overhead, painting bright lines across the stone floor. Jonah unfolded the old map once more. "This passage is not marked." "Because Samuel never finished drawing it," the old man replied. "Only 3 people ever knew about this exit." Ace paused beside a weathered timber beam wedged across the passage. He sniffed the wood before nudging it with his shoulder. Jonah stepped forward to help. Together they shifted the old beam just enough to reveal a hidden opening leading outside. The 3 emerged onto a rocky overlook above the valley, where the cave house appeared far below among the tall pines. Jonah looked back in amazement. No one standing near the house could ever see this trail. "That was exactly the point," the old man answered. As they stood in silence, the distant sound of vehicle doors closing echoed faintly from below. Jonah raised a pair of compact binoculars from his bag. 2 unfamiliar pickup trucks had stopped near the cave house. Several people stepped out and slowly looked around the property. None of them entered immediately. They seemed to be searching for something. "They are too late," Jonah said quietly. The old man folded his arms. They spent decades protecting a lie. They believed the mountain was keeping their secret. They never imagined it was preserving the evidence instead. Jonah looked at the sealed envelope resting inside his bag. "These documents belong somewhere safe." "There is one person you must take them to," the old man replied. "Sheriff Emily Carter. Her father worked beside Samuel Mercer. She has spent years trying to understand why he disappeared." Jonah smiled. "Then that is where we are headed." Ace gave a soft bark as though approving the decision. The old man knelt and gently scratched behind the German shepherd's ears. "You have done exactly what Samuel hoped a faithful dog would do." Ace leaned into the touch before lifting his head toward the valley. Jonah followed the dog's gaze. Far below, one of the visitors walked toward the front porch while another slowly circled the property. None of them looked toward the hidden overlook. Jonah adjusted the strap on his bag. "They can search every room in that house. They will never find what they came for." The old man nodded. "Because the greatest secret was never hidden inside the cave. It was waiting for someone honest enough to carry it into the light." The drive into town felt longer than it had the day before. Jonah kept one hand on the steering wheel, while Ace rested quietly in the passenger seat, his head lifted toward the windshield, as though he understood the importance of what they carried. The old man sat silently in the back seat, looking out at the familiar mountains with peaceful eyes. When they arrived at the sheriff's office, Sheriff Emily Carter met them at the front entrance. She looked first at Jonah, then at Ace, before noticing the worn leather journal tucked beneath Jonah's arm. "You sounded serious on the phone," she said. Jonah nodded. "I found something that belongs to the history of this county." They gathered inside a small conference room, where Jonah carefully placed the journal, the sealed envelope, the photographs, and the file folders onto the table. Emily opened the envelope with steady hands and slowly read the first page. Her expression changed almost immediately. "These signatures," she whispered. "My father used to talk about this investigation, but he believed every record had been lost." The elderly man smiled gently. "They were never lost. They were protected until the right people arrived." Emily spent nearly an hour reviewing the documents before looking up with tears shining in her eyes. Samuel Mercer was telling the truth all along. These files clear his name completely. Jonah leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. Then he can finally be remembered for what he really was. Emily nodded. A man who refused to abandon his oath. She reached across the table and shook Jonah's hand. "Thank you for bringing this here instead of keeping it to yourself." Jonah smiled. "That decision was easy. The difficult part was listening to my partner before I understood what he was trying to tell me." Emily looked toward Ace. The German shepherd sat quietly beside Jonah without asking for attention. She walked over and gently scratched behind his ears. "Looks like this department owes you a great deal, old friend." Ace answered with a slow wag of his tail. Several weeks later, the County Historical Society held a small ceremony outside the restored cave house. A bronze plaque was placed beside the entrance honoring Deputy United States Marshal Samuel Mercer for his integrity, courage, and faithful service. Jonah stood quietly among the crowd, while Emily invited him to step forward. This story reached us because one retired officer refused to ignore the truth, and because one remarkable German shepherd never stopped searching. The applause echoed through the valley as Jonah rested a hand on Ace's shoulder. He looked toward the mountains where the old man stood smiling beneath the tall pines before quietly tipping his hat and walking away without asking for recognition. After the ceremony ended, Jonah and Ace returned to the cave house together. The evening sun painted the limestone walls with warm golden light. Jonah settled into the old wooden chair on the porch and watched Ace stretch comfortably across the smooth stone floor. "Well, partner," he said with a contented smile. "I thought I bought a quiet place to spend retirement." Ace lifted his head and looked at him. Jonah laughed softly. "Instead, you found us one last case." The German shepherd walked over and rested his head against Jonah's knee exactly as he had done after countless long days of service. Jonah looked across the peaceful valley and realized that some homes were purchased with money, but others were earned through honesty, loyalty, and trust. As the first stars appeared above the mountain, the cave no longer felt like a place where secrets had been hidden. It had become a place where the truth had finally found its way home. Thank you so much for watching, all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with friends who might enjoy it too. We would love to know where you are watching from. Tell us your city and country in the comments. More heartfelt and unforgettable hero dog stories are already waiting for you. See you in the next one.